Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It could hardly be a more timely topic to be talking about today than the issue of the book that Paul Clifford has written called The China Paradox, or At the Front Line of Economic Transformation, because that is indeed where we are. And whether we're talking about not conflict but competition, which is one of the themes of his book, whether we're talking about how to deal with China and the Communist Party there, whether we talk about how to deal with Mr. Xi, all these are things that should be of interest to us. And why the Asia Scotland Institute is particularly interested in this is that our mission is to help educate, in particular, tomorrow's leaders to engage with the century of Asia. And to do that, we need to understand the culture and the thinking of the people in the countries that represent Pan-Asia. In fact, on March the 2nd, our next event will be with Lord Karen Bilimoria, the chairman of the CBI, and he will be talking about India within the context of Pan-Asia. So these things are important. With regards to the book, let me just quote what Carla Hill said about it. This is a must-read, not only for those interested in China's trajectory, but also for those interested in global economic and political issues. With its wonderfully narrated cases of how businesses succeed and fall in China, this is required reading for any investor. Its rich historical dissection of China's political economy under communism should be read by any scholar of contemporary China. Simply an amazing book. And you too can buy a copy if you wish and get it signed after this event. I'm really delighted that Owen Kelly, who is known to many of you, and Sarah Liu are on our panel, and you will have seen from the note of the meeting details of their backgrounds. Paul Clifford, who I met, I guess, about a month ago in Boston to talk about coming and doing this. He has a brother in the audience who can identify himself if he wants, but he needn't. And he has a unique perspective of what's been going on in China, built up over a number of years. So without further ado, Paul.
Thank you very much.
There we go.
So I've been asked to talk for maybe a quarter of an hour, 10 minutes, I suppose. And first I want to thank Professor Matheson for hosting us here. It's a wonderful city, and I'm delighted to be here and to meet you for the first time. Also, thanks very much to Aidan and the business school, and of course to Roddy and the Asia Scotland Institute for really hosting and working so hard to get it all done together. So I'm not going to talk too long, because I think we all agree that you find out what your speaker knows about when you ask them questions, not when they lecture you. Yeah, it's an old story. But I do want to make a few points, 4 points really, about how I came to write the book, and end up with a little bit on what my nuanced view of China is. I could have held that back and let you find out, but I think if I put it out there now, it may foster a better discussion. So, firstly, how did I come to write this book? And I do believe the reforms that happened since 1978 in China are one of the most extraordinary transformations of modern history. We may debate, whether who made that happen, whether it was the Chinese people or the party, but it is an extraordinary fact. And through my work over decades in China, I was first an academic, then went into business. I witnessed the transformation firsthand, and I felt, I'd seen Chinese state-owned enterprises close up as I restructured them. I'd seen private companies like Huawei. I consulted to Huawei. And I also, in Cisco, I was responsible for a strategic partnership with China Development Bank. So I was able to get rather unusual access to Chinese companies at an operating level and a C-suite level, which very few people have had the privilege to do. So I thought that I had a story that needed to be told, and a story that fills a lot of gaps in the narrative. So I've adopted a bottom-up approach, right, based on my own first-hand experience. But I did not want it to be just show and tell. There are a lot of those books around too, but or a series of personal anecdotes or war stories. I have plenty of those. I can give you them plenty too. But I wanted to be a narrative that well integrated into academic writing and theory about China. And what I was aiming for was a crossover book, which was accessible to the general reader, but was also useful to postgraduate students. So, I've been using cases from my book in Harvard Kennedy School to, in some master's programs. And I'm proud that, LSE are using my book in their master's in Chinese politics. So, I'm pleased about that. So I'm also a historian. Early on, I was a historian, did a PhD in Chinese history, the 1911 revolution, long before this. But I wanted to put the reforms into historical context, and I began by looking at the earlier efforts to industrialize, which are very, serious efforts over 150 years. And then I, tried to explain the deep hunger for the reform and look back at the 30 years of the Mao period with its dysfunctional Soviet-style planned economy. And then I document how, after the reforms were launched, it took a decade of painful steps to dismantle that debilitating system. And having worked for decades with the three legs of the Chinese economy, the state-owned enterprises, the private firms, and foreign investment, I chose that as my entry point, right, at looking at the reforms. But based on those insights, I tried to shed light more broadly on the transformation of the Chinese economy, society, and culture, much more broadly. And I think it's a slightly different approach for many people. So that's the first point. Second point, what is the China paradox? It's not really a mysterious concept. It's just my term for the hybrid development model that China has developed since 1978, after Mao died. After the failure of 30 years, or relative failure of 30 years under Mao, the Chinese Communist Party, energetically and pragmatically embraced aspects of the market economy as the surest way to ensure its own survival and longevity and its autocratic rule. In turn, the Chinese people made a sort of Faustian pact with the party, which was able to provide a path to wealth creation as well as stability to a nation historically prone to chaos. That's not a trivial thing, though. And so the China paradox is really a situation where seemingly incompatible forces, the party and aspects of the market economy, operated together to create a very, a quite irresistible rise in China. And that's quite an extraordinary cocktail. Whether it was planned, I'm not so sure, but it happened. And we should note that the new model, this new model, the China paradox, is still driven by politics rather than economics. The litmus test of whether a policy is adopted is the extent to which it reinforces or supports party rule, total rule and control. Once we understand that, things become a lot more easy to understand in contemporary China. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. But the real issue with the China paradox is it's a very delicate mechanism that's relied on, for its smooth running, on a rather delicate, it's had 4 decades of party rule, but the smooth running has been due to a rather light hand by the party, not a heavy hand. And I think what we're seeing now is a very different situation. That light hand was both in the economy but right through society, with some egregious exceptions, of course, like Tiananmen massacre. So that's my, to explain very briefly what I mean by the China paradox, and I will discuss in a second whether it's beyond its sell-by date. Is it unraveling? That's the big question mark, right? Is the China paradox beyond its sell-by date? So third question, why did I need a second edition? I first wrote the book in 2017, and there have been a lot of developments since then. So 5 years later, what I found was that that a lot of the key trends showed continuity and further development, which served to validate a lot of the conclusions in the first book. And this is the case with heightened autocracy and growing concentration of power under Xi Jinping. So in the second edition, I mimic Stalin's famous statement in 1930 that communism equals Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole economy. You may have heard of that wonderful statement. Well, I mimic it and say that under Xi Jinping, socialism equals party power plus Neo-Confucianism, Song or Ming style, Wang Yang Ming style from Hangzhou, plus artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is a placeholder for all the tools that China has to make it the most successful example of social surveillance in the world that we've ever seen. So the conclusion in the book is that maybe, not for sure, the China paradox may be unraveling, that Xi may be declaring premature victory in the reforms, that his new era may represent not a new era of the reforms, but a post-reform era. That's, again, we can debate it because you can't be sure, obviously. So the delicate balance that underpins the China paradox may be under threat due to the tightening of party control in China's enterprises, and I've been writing about that recently, whether private or state-owned. It's quite striking, and throughout society as a whole. You know, it's a and in the second edition, I was also able to complete some narratives. Particularly one about a little-known Chinese firm from Anhui province that made its name doing construction in Africa, then went on to do diamond mining in Zimbabwe. Very successful under Mugabe with the army there. Of course, after Mugabe went, they kicked this company out for corruption, and the Chinese company defaulted on over $1 billion of Chinese domestic bonds. So it was a perfect example of a Belt and Road initiative that was flawed and went wrong. It's a great example. So I was able to document the collapse, not just the success at the beginning. And then there's the unfolding saga of Huawei. Huawei Technologies, China's largest technology firm, that has about $90 billion of sales. It was going to have 135 this year, but now it's down to 90 from 110. It's China's biggest company overseas in terms of ICT. Huawei, during the period of writing this, before I was writing the second book, I documented the company, but after that, it came under assault from the USA. And there were also things that deserved to be told, but had not made it into the first edition, such as a curious story of China's casinos, which didn't happen. Investors and Chinese investors wanted to do casinos like crazy, but they couldn't happen for a lot of reasons. So that's a funny little thing. There's also my visit to a tea-growing village in Zhejiang, where Xi's environmental thought was created. And then finally, I had to address, so for Huawei, I wrote a whole new chapter just on Huawei, which I think is, still stands up. I also had to create a new chapter on China, on addressing China's growing friction with the world. And that had to cover in more intensity China's human rights abuses, whether in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, across the nation, which have sparked justified global outrage. And I also throw new light on the Belt and Road Initiative, and I also look at the efforts being made to contain China through a technology war. So that's what's new in there. There's quite a lot. There's 40,000 new words in the second edition, but it's quite a lot. Some books are that long, right? And then finally, I wasn't going to do this, but I thought I'd do this now and give you a sort of sneak preview of my nuanced view on China, so that you can then debate it rather than trying to pull it out of me during the question and answer session. I'll put it into two parts. What we must do to be wary of China and why we must work with China. So China is a highly autocratic state that's taken social surveillance and control to a totally new level, never seen in the world, in my humble opinion. Even though America is pretty good at it, Britain's quite good at it, I think China has taken it to a new level across the whole of society. So given that, I think it's quite smart not to buy their telecom equipment for our country. They should sell it to other people, that's fine. But we don't have to have it, nor do we need to have Hikvision cameras on all our police forces. There could be some problems down the road, and why take that risk? So That's just a practical thing, and I want to make quite clear. I think we should also be vigilant about China's growing military. I don't think they're a challenge yet to the United States, but they could become, and they could be a threat in some areas of the world. So we should keep an eye on that, but not overhype the Chinese threat, because that's what's going on at the moment. The military threat, I should say. And I think we should not be seduced by China's soft power. By the way, I'm not against Confucius Institutes. Sir Peter, you know, I want to make sure that Wang Xiaomei, this is Wang Xiaomei?
Yeah.
Oh, no, nice to meet you. I did my homework. So I'm totally for Confucius Institutes, and that's fine. Yeah. But I think we shouldn't be, you know, seduced by China's, you know, politeness and, you know, seductive attitude towards bringing people in. I think the CCP hasn't changed its spots. Its DNA is still the same CCP that did all those things in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And they don't share our values. They don't want to be like us, and they don't share our values in any shape or form. Individual Communist Party members are fine, but when they get in a room together, it becomes quite a different matter. And I've dealt with the Communist Party in so many ways, and they're perfectly reasonable people. But they do, together, as a party, they can do all sorts of things. And we should call out China on human rights abuses. I mean, I think there's room for something probably better than Blair's ethical foreign policy, something better than that. It's difficult, though, given we're trying to do investment and trade with China. It's really hard, but I think we have to do it. You know, you can probe, and I'll probably come up with very few answers on how to do it, but we need to do it. And we shouldn't allow China to declare that it has sovereign rights over the South China Sea. You know, that China can treat Southeast Asia like vassal states, you know, which it did during its imperial period. We shouldn't allow that. I'm not sure whether we should go to war, but I think we should be pushing back. And equally, I think we should sustain the status quo on Taiwan. Yeah? We can discuss what that is, but I think China wants the status quo to continue, and I think we should want the status quo, which works well for China and mainland and for Taiwan at the moment. So those are some of the caveats. Just to end up, however, right, China says its rise is peaceful, and it wants to play a constructive role in the world order. I think we should take them at their word, you know, for the time being, and encourage them to play that role if that's what they want to play. You may call me naive, but I think that's how we have to play it at this stage. And we should encourage them to actually play that role. We should not seek to contain or disable that rise. Yeah? We should not engage in a new Cold War. Yeah? Nor should we have a technology war with a bifurcation of technology between the two areas. I'm not the only one standing up around America and other places saying we're sleepwalking into conflict with China. I mean, I say it very seriously. The dangers aren't just about war; it's about accidental war, you know, in South China Sea or anywhere else. So, you know, I think we are sleepwalking, and a lot of people, right and left in America, are saying that finally. The U.S. says there are three types of relationships. There's with China: adversarial, competitive, and collaborative. I think we need to, if we only emphasize competition, it can easily move towards adversarial. So we need more of the collaboration or the cooperation, as some people prefer to call it. I think we need much, much more of that. And the also thing is, if we only emphasize competition, you know, and we do that in technology, we will end up with real conflict. You know, some people much older than me may remember before the First World War, there was the steel race, right, between Germany and Britain. Germany finally overtook Britain in both volume and technology and productivity in steel, and that was a milestone. So, you know, we should be very mindful that these things, you know, lead in a certain direction, which is very, very dangerous. And so I want to say that finally, China has been playing catch up over the years. And it's included IPR theft, yes, predatory pricing, yes, government subsidies, basically not playing it according to the so-called rules-based game. You know, the rules are rules, of course, but still not playing it according to the rules. But you may ask, well, why did America wake up in 2019 or 18 and start going after Huawei? Was it because they'd been stealing the technology? Well, when I was in Cisco, we respected Huawei, not because it stole our technology, which it did, but because it was innovating. The reason the US is going after China is not because it was doing all those terrible things. It's because it's finally breaking from the catch-up mode into an innovation mode in some areas, not every area. And in that way, they're challenging America's economic hegemony, and that is unacceptable to some people in the world. They're transcending the old mode and now getting to an innovation mode. So, I would argue that it's much better to invest to compete rather than try to attempt to win a running race by tripping up an agile runner. So I've laid out my nuanced view, and you may think that it's appeasement or panda hugger stuff, but I think it's a little bit balanced, and I hope we can discuss it. So now that you'll find out whether I really know anything by asking questions. Okay.
Paul, thank you very much. Well, I think the first questions you're going to get are from the other panelists, and then that will pave the way for the audience to participate. Would you like to start off?
Sure. I thought I would offer some of my thoughts on the book and ask some questions. If that's okay?
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. Well, it's an absolute honor to speak about your book tonight, The China Paradox at the Asia Scotland Institute. So thank you and the business school for inviting. Oh yeah, is it not on? Can you hear me better now? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So thank you, the Asia Scotland Institute and the Business School for the invitation to be here today. I appreciate everyone's efforts in putting tonight's event, organizing for tonight's event, and thank you all for being here today. I'm Dr. Sarah Liu, Senior Lecturer in Gender and Politics at the School of Social and Political Science. While I enjoy the privilege of being here today, I also want to take a moment to recognize that many of my colleagues who work at the University of Edinburgh, as well as 150 other universities across the UK, are currently taking industrial action for fair working conditions, decent and equal pay, job security, and pensions. Universities are at the forefront of knowledge production, and we play a crucial role in shaping the future of society. It is precisely because of our labor, often unpaid, that makes tonight's event possible. So before I offer my thoughts on the book, I'm here to ask you for your support as we fight for a future where education and knowledge production are not a privilege, but a right for all. So I teach a course on, thank you. I teach a course on Chinese politics at the honors level for the very first time last semester. It was a very popular course. It was oversubscribed. And your book, China Paradox, is a must-read for my students as it provides important insights into contemporary Chinese politics and political events. As China continues to modernize its economy and expands its global influence, understanding the political and economic dynamics of the country is essential. And as you mentioned just now, not only does the book provide a historical overview of China's economic transformation, but also covers the key policy changes that were implemented, including the establishment of the special economic zones and the introduction of market-oriented reforms. And the book also provides more in-depth analysis of the key factors that are driving China's economic growth. The book provides an overview of China's manufacturing sector, which has been a key driver of economic growth since the 80s. So why do I think China Paradox is a must-read? Well, one of the strengths of the book is Paul's ability to present very complex economic concepts in a very clear and concise manner. He provides numerous examples and case studies to illustrate his points, making the book accessible for both experts and non-experts, and my students as well. And additionally, Paul draws on his own experiences of living and working in China, which adds a personal dimension to the book. So the book also does an excellent job of highlighting the challenges that China faces as it continues to modernize its economy. For example, Paul notes that China's heavy reliance on exports and investments has led to imbalance in its economy, which then may lead to future economic slowdown. And additionally, Paul doesn't shy away from discussing the challenges that China faces in transitioning from a low-cost manufacturing economy to high-tech, innovation-driven economy. So some of the issues that were raised just now, right, the human rights issues and, like China's relations with other countries in the world, those are issues that China faces. And I'm very glad to see that Paul doesn't shy away from expressing those, discussing those issues. And another strength of the book is a discussion of the political and social implications of China's economic transformation. And as a political scientist myself, that is perhaps what interests me the most. What I find really interesting is the book's contributions and its analysis of China's one-party system and the challenges that the country faces in terms of its political reform. Obviously, as we learn more about the important insights into China's approach to global politics and the challenges that it faces and its efforts to expand its influence, I'm very happy to see that the book highlights the need for China to be a more open and democratic society and provides insights into China's approach to global politics. So I read the second edition of the book, which was published in 2022, and I really appreciate your efforts in including the case studies of Alibaba and Huawei and how these corporations are both aided as well as bounded by the Chinese Communist Party. And while what happened with Alibaba and Huawei is not too long ago, but it also seems like ages ago because of the pandemic, right? So it feels like a lot of what happened happened before during the pandemic. And we also know that China has changed, I would say, not just drastically over the last few decades, but over the last 3 years, China has changed a lot, right? So for example, we know that political stability is crucial to attract foreign investment. However, we know that China hasn't exactly been stable, right, politically in the last few years, ranging from the movements and revolutions in Hong Kong, particularly the way Beijing handled these movements, right, escalated localism and independence of Hong Kong to the human rights violations in Xinjiang. And the Chinese Communist Party's violation of human rights has also been a significant issue in China, particularly in recent years, right? The book provides insights into the economic and political dynamics that have contributed to these violations and highlights the need for China to develop a more open and democratic society in order to address these issues. But my questions for you then is, about more recent changes since the pandemic, and I'm very interested in learning about how your thoughts on how China handled, how Xi Jinping handled the pandemic, starting from the very, very strict measures of the pandemic and the lockdowns to pretty much responding. I don't know if you would call that Xi was responding to the dissent, calling for the regime to open up, right? But I thought that you could speak a few words about that. And I'm also very interested in your opinions about what it means, right? Because if we understand how autocracy works, is that autocracies don't usually give in, right? Because the moment that you give in to dissent, that opens up to the future possibilities of protests, right? And more demands from the regime. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what your thoughts on what the open up means, not just to the general public in China, but also what it means to Xi's leadership, especially since it's his third term, right? We don't know if it's just his third term or his last term. And also, as a gender scholar, I must ask you some questions about the Me Too movement in China, because it's often connected with the A4 revolution, right? With the A4 revolution, which is like the white paper revolution, which people basically just held out paper asking and demanding for the lockdowns to be lifted, right? The restrictions to be lifted. But at the same time, I don't know if it's a deliberate step that the Chinese Communist Party is equating that or connecting that with the Me Too movements in China. And I say that because we know a few people, I think a dozen or so activists have been arrested since the A4 revolution. And ironically, they all happen to be women.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I thought you could speak a few words on that, but I'm not going to take away more time. And thank you.
Sarah, thank you, and I'm assured that you're not his agent, because you've done a really good plug for the book. Right, Paul.
So, first, COVID. Yeah, when I wrote the book, they were into the first year, and it looked like China was handling it very well. The economy was continuing to grow. It looked like it, they were dodging the bullet. I think you have a lot of Chinese intellectuals, professors, and also senior business people are appalled at how Xi Jinping got it wrong. Both in not having older people vaccinated, and then relying on their own vaccines, which were relatively good but not very good, and really getting completely wrong, and then going to the lockdown. I think the ordinary people, got to the end of their tether, and they did send a message to Xi Jinping, particularly, and the party, and so I think he was taken aback by the ferocity of the accusations, which were more about him than the party, by the way. And that's an interesting thing, that the people took it out on Xi Jinping, and I think that Xi Jinping's autocratic power, as opposed to his power in the Politburo, collective power, has been dented to some extent. So I think the ordinary people were furious, and I've talked to Chinese, I talk all the time with Chinese professors. I haven't been back for a while, but I talk to them all the time, and one said they may clamp down massively on the people who protested, or they may clamp down to some extent and then back off. I think they've done the latter. I think they're not going after those people as much as they could, but they're obviously rounding up some of them. But I think the ordinary people in China, well, put it this way, I think the COVID experience was an awful experience, and it highlighted the fact that China's issues aren't economic. There's plenty of problems with real estate and everything else, but they've always muddled through, and they have a lot of cash, and it's a rich country in some ways. It's the governance that you should worry. And Xi Jinping's written more than 4 volumes on China's governance. Well, their issue is governance, not the economics. And so what it revealed was that the party is often poorly informed or ill-equipped to deal with things. And I saw that in Sichuan during the earthquake. That wasn't a man-made earthquake, but the problems around it were made by the party. The lack of surveillance or a good building code for those schools that collapsed. You may remember Ai Weiwei's one. The fact that the army didn't have helicopters. Yeah. They didn't have helicopters because they were always afraid of helicopters because they could be, they could be a risk. So they didn't have those. So the army was ill prepared. But once they got down to it, they could turn it around. And I think the same, they poured people into Sichuan. I went down there with them, and they poured effort. The same thing with COVID. I think that they will, first of all, they will turn on the propaganda machine very, very strongly. They have. To say, we take credit for, saving you from the worst, and then we've lost 1.5 million people, but that's not as many as we might have expected. So I think they will be taking credit for it. So I think for the ordinary people, the social contract with the party, which is there, intact, is still intact. It's dented a little bit. I think Xi Jinping's personal influence and power in his third term is a little bit dented, and the intellectuals. One Chinese professor said to me the other day on a safe telephone line in New York, where he was in a hotel, he said, he's ignorant. That's what he said. He's ignorant. Now, Xi Jinping was a worker peasant soldier in 75, as people in China. In those days, you didn't have an exam to get into the university, and you didn't have an exam to get out. So that's not a great qualification, chemical engineering. Then he did a PhD on Marxism and Leninism. I don't know who wrote it for him. But the point is that the intellectuals in China think he is relatively ignorant, although he's a good party man and is quite competent. So I think intellectuals are reserving their view, and who knows, there's a lot of talk about factions. China, you talk about political risk. You were talking about political risk, and we thought that, well, the world thought that China had somehow dealt with its succession crises. Who would be the next, without any democratic process or public process. How do they have a new leader bubble up? Well, they solved it in several generations, and then bang, Bo Xilai in Chongqing was arrested, for murder, and Zhou Yongkang, the head of public security, was arrested and was sent to, So the whole issue of factionalism and fissures in China, which are not going to bring down China anytime soon, but are there. So everybody, and the Chinese themselves, are looking at this. Who is aligning with him? At the moment, we'll know more in the National People's Congress in March next month, how they will line up the right people in the government structure. The party had its meeting in last October. Now the National People's Congress will be held, and we'll see whether he does the same thing, surrounding himself with yes men as opposed to experts. Liu He, he's a vice premier. He's been going around the world. He's very smart. He talks really well, and he's very competent. But will we have somebody like Liu He becoming the vice premier in charge of the economic affairs? We don't know. So we'll wait and see. But I think so. That's a long-winded answer. On the truth, put it this way: under Mao, there were some wonderful things that happened for women. The marriage law of 1950 was a milestone. It abolished polygamy and second wives. It gave women the right to divorce. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of women divorced themselves immediately after that terrible time. And it looked like there would be more women coming up into government. That hasn't. It happened for a period. There was one vice premier, Liu Yandong, was quite a powerful woman in the Politburo, not the Standing Committee, but in the Politburo. So women have come up to a certain level. We, as a Ministry of Commerce, but at corporate level, there were many women who I've met and who are very powerful, strong CEOs. And particularly party secretaries, because women often made it into the human resources side of big companies, and they were the typical person who ran the union and ran the party branch. So party secretaries are often women, and very interesting. But then on a personal side, I saw in my own company, I was running a business in Beijing, my colleagues, amongst them, they've come in with black faces. They had, they were being beaten up by their wives, by their husbands, I should say. So, although that probably happened too. So the level of violence against women, as reforms have happened, I think is something that's very alarming. And what is, really sick-making about the Chinese autocratic state is that anybody who wants to defend people's rights, farmers' rights, lawyers who stand up to, they get put in jail. The same with women. Female activists in the last 10 years under Xi Jinping have been horribly treated and are now, in fear of their life. They're harassed, they're abused, and there have been a lot of cases of rape where women have posted, the information, much as it happens in the Met or whatever. And they posted all this information only thinking that they would be listened to, but they were not, because it's seen as destabilizing in the wrong way for the party. So to the Me Too movement, I don't know about link. I think many women have been involved in some of these movements, maybe during the anti-COVID, but I think that Chinese foreign NGOs are having a really bad time in China.
Paul, thank you very much. We'll probably come to that, the Q&A in a minute, but I'd like to ask Owen Kelly now to participate. Thanks, Owen.
Oh, thank you. Yes. My questions, all the questions that came to my mind on reading the book were slightly different, which is a good thing. But I suppose a couple of general observations about the book I think are really, really important. I mean, you mentioned nuance in your opening remarks, and in the book you make it very clear that you have a nuanced view. And I think that's incredibly important and incredibly valuable. The difficult thing about nuance, of course, is that it's difficult. It's much easier in some ways to take a very clear-cut view, and as I think you referred or at least hinted at, in the United States at the moment, there's a lot of politicians, and some here in the UK, who are taking a very, very sort of definitive view. And I think that China, with all its complexity and geographical difference just doesn't make sense to see it in those very direct, simplistic terms. So I really welcome the nuance of the book.
Thank you.
My questions really are about how China is perceived internationally and how it presents itself perhaps internationally, which you do touch on in the book. I won't follow up Sarah's question on COVID and your observations in the book about how the party and the state has, arguably in the past shown itself to be quite adept and quite effective at dealing with very large dislocations and crises, and the question of whether COVID is now something different, I'll leave to one side. But one question I did want to ask you with this historic overview that you take, particularly in the way that China has presented itself to the West throughout this period of, as it I think used to be called, peaceful rise. I don't think that's the same phrase that's used now, but during that time it strikes me that for those willing to adopt a nuanced view, China's never really misrepresented itself. I don't think China has ever. I think you made the point in your opening remarks that China and the state of, I'm talking here about the government of China, I don't think the government of China has ever made any claim or even suggested that it embraces what we might think of as democratic values or values around the separation of powers and these kind of ideas. It's always been pretty clear that they are rejected, and sometimes in extremely stark terms. It's always been very clear. I was looking recently at some of the speeches given every National Day by the ambassadors around the world for China. They're all on the websites, and it's pretty clear that there's a very, very solid commitment to the Marxist state and to the centralised form of government that you described so well. So I just wondered whether you agreed with that, and whether, or the obvious point that follows from that is whether there's been, some wishful thinking, in fact, over the years. There's that famous anecdote of George Bush going and having a meeting with a Chinese minister, and he said to George W. Bush, and George W. Bush welcomes the opening up of the free market in China as he perceived it, and the Chinese side said, no, that's not what's happening at all. We're simply doing this and that in order to strengthen the Chinese state and look after the Chinese people. And George Bush winked at him, as if colluding with him, as if to say, but we know what's really going on. It's all about the market, isn't it? And I think that it's an anecdote that perhaps illustrates something quite significant, that over the years and I just wondered whether you agreed with that. And I suppose I just wanted to suggest as well a couple of paradoxes about the way China, and I'm talking again about the state of China, presents itself to the world. And it's really this issue of soft power, which you touched on. I actually think soft power is a really big problem for China. I think we all know, I'm sure we're all aware, a huge amount of effort goes into the projection of soft power through the United Front and a great deal of state-directed activity. But perhaps one of the paradoxes of that is that it doesn't feel to me, sitting here in the comfort of my lovely Western university, that it's really getting through to people in terms of really conveying the kind of more positive idea of China that I guess the state of China wants to convey. I suspect there's a number of reasons for that, but what it also leads to, and this might be a paradox, is that dissident voices from China, I would guess that Ai Weiwei is much better known than any state-sponsored projector of state-sponsored projection of China. And I'm just wondering whether there isn't a paradox there, that for all the effort going into the projection of soft power, in a strange way, it's actually acting negatively. And the final question I just wanted to mention, because it just struck me in the section of the book where you're talking about how state-owned enterprises have been very successful in all sorts of ways. And I just wondered if you saw any similarity between the approach in China and the South Korean chaebol, where you've also got heavy state involvement allied with private capital and private enterprise. And I just wondered if you thought that there was something unique about China, or whether that was a model that perhaps had emerged in other parts of Asia as well.
Well, Oh, wonderful questions. The thing was Sarah.
Well, they won't be as good as the answers, that's for sure.
You struck me last week. This addressed, what the perceptions. One of the big issues of the last 20 years is that China, the West feels duped by China somehow, that they had signed up for something called convergence. That's, if you sent them equipment and you wrapped it up with some New York Times pages, they'd read the New York Times pages and become more liberal. And the same with Hong Kong, that there will be convergence between the mainland and China. I actually hope there might be some, but there never was. It was the convergence in the wrong way. And so there was this, a lot of people were kidding themselves. And when Deng Xiaoping famously went down to Houston and donned a hat, a cowboy hat, people thought, well, he believes in capitalism. Well, no, he believed in borrowing tools of capitalism to prop up the Chinese state and to make socialism work. Remember that. They want. So the West feel duped, and there are lots of great people, left and right in America, who feel deceived by the Chinese government. And in a way, they shouldn't have been, because the Chinese leaders wrote all the way through about what they wanted to do. And Deng Xiaoping said it. They all said it. There'll be no wavering away from one-party state and the autocratic rule. That is unchallengeable. But everything else can be done because it will support that. That's the point. So when you understand it, it gets easier to understand China. So there was a complete misunderstanding, and it was fueled by a lot of people who wanted to do business and trade. And it made it easier to do business with a very autocratic country, even after 1989 and the massacre of Tiananmen, or Fuxing Wei. They could still get, wanted to trade with China like crazy, and people like Hank Paulson, people like that, they spread the idea that China is really, on a road to capitalism. Well, the Chinese party never said that. They didn't want a division of powers. They didn't want any form of pluralism. But more importantly, they wanted to save the state sector to prove that socialism can survive. And in other words, the whole goal, they were happy with private enterprises because they help the economy survive and provide a lot of wealth and innovation. But at the end of the day, they are a disposable part because they don't fit into the social economy and have to be incorporated into it. The state-owned enterprises, after you got rid of hundreds of thousands of small ones, the remaining 100 or so large ones were viable, with people like me helping them make it work, right? Before we restructured them and saved them from terminal decline. They were going to collapse completely, and the government wouldn't have the money to help them. So they listed on the stock market, got other people's money in, but basically they gave them a new life, and that was successful. So the goal was totally different. And so, but I would say all along that period, China adhered to Deng Xiaoping's view that you should fly under the radar, do things quietly and not really shout about what you want to do. And around 1919, they turned the switch. 2000, I'm talking about 2018, they turned the switch, and they came out, the wolf warrior stuff, they came out very assertive, and actually the result was that, well, they went around the world talking about the Belt and Road, how it's going to be this and that. It was a huge political construct from Deng Xiaoping, from Xi Jinping. Of course, it's really an economic thing, dressed up as politics, not the other way around. But they made a big thing of it. They talked about China 2025, how China was going to shoot the lights out in every economic sector, and implied that they would come close to America in GDP. Well, they're not going to. They're not catching up on GDP or per capita, and certainly not in productivity growth. China's not catching up America, no way, in the near future or the middle future. So China abandoned that pretense, or that sailing under the radar, and at the same time still kept up their soft power stuff. And a Chinese consul came to visit me in Harvard the other day, a consul general from New York, and he one-to-one, and he wanted to know what's going wrong. And I told him lots of things, and I said that your soft power is totally failing because, while you want to have, while you want to have a discussion, you're also doing these things in Xinjiang, which are well documented. You can't, it's not working. The soft power is a failure under Xi Jinping, a total, utter, a mess. And a lot of money is being spent, but not. So I do think that China is at the moment on a charm offensive. They sent people overseas. They're trying to rebuild bridges. And I think some in America want to stop those bridges being built. There may be people in China who don't want to rebuild bridges. It's possible. But I think Xi Jinping is on a charm offensive, wants to rebuild trust. There is no trust, between two countries. So that's my take.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
But you talked about chaebols. Do you all know what chaebols are? It's a typical, out of the sort of military fascist regime in South Korea grew a democratic regime, right? But in that regime, there were, in that sort of form of society, there were these large companies that had been formed, through the military and through autocracy, and these groups were huge. They're called chaebols, and they really squeezed out the private economy because they were semi-state, but basically they were huge conglomerates, going from shipbuilding to technology to mobile phones, just everything all. And the Chinese actually studied the chaebols when I was there, and they were very interested in chaebols and said, we're not going to do it. And many of the problems that China faces with its largest companies, like HNA, Hainan Air, and even Costco Shipping, which owns lots of real estate and is ship, their problems were because they had conglomerates. So I think they've steered away from imitating the Koreans or the Keiretsus of Japan. I think they.
Well, when I was framing the question, I thought it was stretching a point to compare with Japan, but please.
But they have focused on having companies that were focused in one area, and because of consultants like me, you must be focused. You can't be spread across. You've got to know what you are, because if you know what you are, then all the economics, the financing, your marketing, everything will fit around that one vision. Otherwise, it's very complicated. So, so I think they shied away from that.
Thank you.
Heavily.
Paul, thank you. I'm conscious that we've got lots of people in the room who might have questions for you, so thank you for that. And I hope that the comments you've heard will stimulate you to ask questions. Here are the ground rules. Asking a question is all about putting the question. Second thing is, would you please say who you are, say genuinely who you are, don't pretend to be someone else. And the third thing is use a mic. And there are microphones, I think, at the back and in the front here. There's one here.
One there.
Okay. Who would like to start us off? So, Peter, would you like to start us off?
I'll save mine.
You will save
Oh,
yours.
dear.
Who'd like to ask a question?
The quick thrust.
So, lady there, in white, thank you. So say who you are and ask a question.
Hi everyone. And I'm Louise. I'm the student studying in the University of Edinburgh, and I'm doing the business study with the marketing, and I'm from China as well. So nice to meet you. And my question is, I want to ask how you perceive the future of the manufacturing industry of China and about the supply chain, because like for example, like before the COVID, like many I think the foreign companies, they moving their supply chains from China to the Southeast Asia, like the Thailand and the Vietnam, I guess. And like during the pandemic, I think the movement, like it shifts more roughly, more sharply. But I think maybe China, the government, they have noticed the problem, so they are doing a reforming in the education now. I think like maybe they cancel some large exam. For example, there's an exam in China called 中考, like is for the people they go for the people they go to the high school.
Thank you very much. We've got the question, and that's great. And don't forget, everybody, it's the 300th anniversary of the birth of Adam Smith, and some Adam Smith thinking in that question and maybe in the answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Paul.
I think the heart of it was about, what's happening to manufacturing and where might it go. And I have a general feeling that China would not like to be the just a low cost manufacturing base, which is not today. It would like to move some of that manufacturing to other countries. Dirty work, I think China would, in a way, would like to be more like America, almost a consuming country, and have. That's a long vision, though. But because the reality is that only 60% of China, 62% of China is now urbanized. Oh no, maybe 70%. But at least a third of China remains to be urbanized and developed in a sort of market economy way. So China still is very much focused on those things. When it comes to the supply chain and foreign companies, I think that's a really interesting question, because it is happening. And I think that whether it was the things I mentioned, China's political instability, I think China risk is now much higher. It's A plus or A minus or whatever. But I think it's really higher because of the issues you see in China, but also because of COVID mishandling, a lot of issues where China's governance has been flawed, and the interfering in industry, into companies, it goes on unabated. The reason foreign investment will not abandon China in a big way is that most of it is there for the China market. China is a 20 million unit car market of the world. They're not going to leave, and nor will their suppliers who've given the glass and the paint and everything for the car. So a lot of the foreign investment will stay because they're allowed to make profit still, within certain bounds. But at the same time, because of those risks I mentioned, a lot of smart companies are doing some diversification away from China risk. That is not happening in terms of going back to America. Okay, there's going to be a semiconductor plant in Arizona, for TSMC, but mostly it's not going back to America. It's not going to happen. As you say, it's going to Southeast Asia, and the beneficiaries are Thailand, but particularly Indonesia and Singapore and other countries. India is trying to pick up the pieces from China, but they have they have a fund of like $30 billion for semiconductors to attract people. Samsung is putting a semiconductor plant into India. The trouble is, it's a bit late. The market's already set with China at the heart of it. So I think there will be, if you look at Apple, what are they going to do? They have in China for China. They're not going to leave China. It's a huge market, and they're sitting on a lot of profits. And they have a lot of their supply chain done there. But they're already diversifying their supply chain away from China to some extent, but not massively.
Well, thanks. Owen, you wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to, I suppose, wonder whether a lot of what we've been talking about has been about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state. And I mean, obviously, Paul, everything you say is right. I suppose I just wonder, almost as a follow-up question to you, how significant will be the geopolitics in stopping some of those things? So, I mean, I think it's just tipped over, hasn't it, that now the GDP in China is more than half domestic. So, couldn't we expect from a lot of what we've been saying that the Chinese government will take a pretty, hard approach to things like friendshoring is one of the terms that we now use for the process you're describing for manufacture for the American consumer moving to friends.
Yeah. When you say a tough stance by China, do you mean that them actually insisting that you stay in China, or they will kick you out?
Would they not be very risk averse in terms of any manufacturing moving out of China?
Yeah. I think that the geopolitics are very toxic and very powerful. I mean, if you look at the way the United States has gone to ASML, the semiconductor equipment manufacturer in Holland, they're able, through their pressure, to put massive pressure on other countries, and I think that will go on. But the interesting thing is that the greatest guarantee of decoupling, disengaging, which is happening to some extent, We're not denying it completely. The biggest guarantee is actually business. I mean, you look at the semiconductor industry in association with America. They're playing the game with the CHIPS Act, and they're helping to bring companies to America, semiconductor. But they tell me, I'm a friend of them. I know them very well. They say, at the very best, 10% of stuff will come back to America on semiconductor. So the biggest guarantee is that the businesses plan for 25, 30 years. Well, administrations come and go of 4 years, 5 years. I mean, trusts even 5 months, 3 months, I don't know. 3 weeks, was it? I'm not sure.
47 days, I think.
What?
I think it was 47 days.
Right, a night. God, that was long. So basically, business is the thing, and they are not going to disrupt the supply chains they built over many decades. They will diversify a bit, but they're not in a mood. So China. I think China can still drive quite a hard bargain. I think it has a lot of power and influence because its market is very big. And Tim Cook of Apple is, and a friends of mine who've worked with him closely, it fully understands all the risks, all the political risks of working in China, the supply chain risks, working with Foxconn, who have all their toxic labor issues, but they still go for it because of the Chinese market. And so I think business doesn't react that quickly, and they're very, very, very cautious. And again, I don't, the China's got a long way to go developmentally too.
Paul, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. We've got two questions. The lady in red with her hand up, and then back this way, a gentleman had his hand up. The chap with the pink shirt. Let's take both questions, and then we'll come back to you here.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So I work for an asset manager here in Edinburgh, and we invest in lots of Chinese companies on behalf of our clients and also companies with operations in China. And a lot of those are involved in the energy transition, and they source materials from Xinjiang. And when we invest in these companies, we do rather strong due diligence. But I just wanted to ask what your stance was in terms of foreign investment related to Xinjiang.
Thank you very much.
Xinjiang.
Yeah.
Yes.
Paul, hang on a sec. And then the second question, please. Come forward, 2 rows. There we go. Yep.
Hello, my name is Roger Smiley, and I actually work for the same asset management firm as my colleagues, so it's just a coincidence that we're
Walter
both here.
Scott?
Sorry?
Walter Scott?
Bailey Gifford.
Oh,
We're both
okay.
Bailey Giffords, who are investors, big investors in China. But I have a bit of more of a macro question, which I've pondered a bit myself on China, so it's less investment related. But how much of a risk do you think of China existing in the current form over the next 50 years? I mean, I wonder if there's a chance that it's going to go through something that we saw in Russia, the USSR in the 80s, maybe trying to reunify now, but where a number of the satellite areas which speak very different languages, very culturally quite diverse, east to west, actually, I mean, you can keep a lid on it for a while, but eventually some of those are going to demand self-rule and break away. And I might be completely wrong, but I'm just interested if you've got any thoughts on that.
Thank you. And there's also a shrinking population, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Shrinking.
So,
To answer quickly. Xinjiang investment, yeah. I think we can. I've been asked this by lots of people, so I practiced my answer a little bit. I think we can take a stand on Xinjiang without disengaging with China. I think we can. Investment is hard. You can tell whether the cotton comes from Xinjiang, right? You can look at its DNA and you can see the cotton comes from Xinjiang. But not everything in Xinjiang is slave labor. No, it's. I've been to Xinjiang, and it's lots of they create lots of grapes and other things. But when you talk about Volkswagen's plant in Urumqi, Volkswagen have a plant there. Volkswagen says it's not going to disengage. Volkswagen make what? About 5 million cars. I don't know how many million cars in China. Only 20,000 are assembled in Urumqi, so they could pull out of there. So I think you can say we will not engage with Xinjiang, but we will engage with the rest of China. Although in a way, it's the same party that's doing the same thing to people in Hong Kong, and it's a little difficult to really carve out that part. But Xinjiang is very egregious and I've been to Kashgar and seen it for myself. I mean, the repression is quite extraordinary in Kashgar. So the question is, if Volkswagen pulled out their manufacturing, what would happen? Would they still have their service and the sales network there? And they finance that network. They don't always own it, but they finance it. So how do they disengage? It's very hard, but I think you can do it. And I think we should tell the Chinese that we're going to ring fence stuff to do with Xinjiang, and I think that's quite legitimate. So, but it's very hard when you're making an investment to know who is a supplier. In the early days, it was like there were 5 or 6 levels of supply to any company. People who made things for other pieces into a vehicle or whatever. And today it's still the same thing. There are lots of different sub-suppliers. So how do you know what you're getting? And the point is, when you invest and do the due diligence, you can't just rely on the Chinese to tell you the right thing. You have to go and do it yourself. So it's very expensive and very troublesome. So you have to hire endless consultants. So that was the first one. And then the second question on the next 50 years, and you could say that Mexico had the PRI in the Revolutionary Party of the PRI party for 80 years before there was any pluralism in Mexico. The two-party system only emerged after about 70 or 80 years. So you can see countries that evolve, but the Chinese Communist Party, I don't think, is in a mood to dismount the beast, because if it dismounts the beast, there'll be so many, blood debts to be settled. So it's very difficult when you run such an autocracy to change or and the default is always never, except under periods under Deng Xiaoping, the default was always to the more safer, more conservative way. So I think that the chances are China will trundle on quite well for 25, 30 years, probably underperforming, struggling to get beyond a second tier wealth level, the middle income trap, trying to get out of that, will probably struggle. But after that, I think the issue will become the issue of transparency and accountability of the government, which is already a problem and is causing huge friction, and interfering in industry like crazy. Private and particularly state-owned firms, it's absolutely atrocious. So this will hamper China's growth, and I think undermine eventually the party will be shown to be a political fossil. At that time, what happens? Will China become a modern pluralistic society? I'm not so sure. It might become more like a traditional imperial system. Who knows? But I think that looking out 25 years, long before after I'm dead, China will probably be very similar. But over 50 years, a lot of people ask me about who's going to succeed India or China. I say, let's wait and see. Because India could do better than China because of certain factors, which is the political governance. I'm not saying they will. I'm just saying they could.
Paul, thank you. Okay, there's a lady here. I know I've seen the gentleman at the back and someone here. So here in the second row.
Difficult question.
Again, if you could say who you are and ask a question.
Hello, thank you for your explanation and everything. My name is Intan. I'm studying here. I'm studying finance here as master student, and I really want to ask something about China. I live in Southeast Asia, which been explained that there are a lot of expansion in terms of economy, that many kind of industry replaced to Southeast Asian country like Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. And also I heard about the kind of like China is now lending a lot of money to many developing countries, not only in East Asian, but to African countries also, and there are a lot of credit default there and everything. What I want to ask is China is really like doing like expansion because it's like on the peak of the wealth, or is it already saturated so they have to expand and give money or lend money to developing countries, or is it like they want to expand their political forward
Yeah.
to the other developing countries to be like maybe like America and everything. That's what I want to ask.
Thank you. And there's a question here, and then a gentleman at the back. Simon.
Simon Milne, Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, not an economist. Ronnie picked up on this earlier on, but the shrinking population, it was negative last year. How is that in the longer term going to impact the social and economic policy of China? Going back to the 50-year question, I suppose.
And I think we can take a third. There's a gentleman whose hair I envy. Up there. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Oscar. I'm a business student at Leeds University. I know earlier you mentioned factionalism within the CCP. This is probably quite a difficult one to see, but do you see any internal challenges coming at any point in the near future to Xi or any of the other sort of
great
top
question.
Politburo?
Great question. Thank you. Right, three
Okay.
to bat with.
Okay.
Do come in, please.
Question really is China behaving like the East India Company? And I don't think so. I mean, I think the Belt and Road is, above all, an economic construct, because China developed lots of technologies and products which you can sell, like making holes in mountains, building bridges, hydro dams, power stations, all those things. That technology they perfected in great volume and very efficiently, so they can do it faster than anybody else. And there is a political dimension to all that. They line up and give money to those countries. The one thing that, I talked to one official from Rwanda the other day, and he said, well, the US never came knocking. We abandoned those countries for so long that China came knocking. And also, the term, when you do a World Bank project, for instance, you may know that there are like 3 different identification projects, and it takes forever, like 10 years to get anything dispersed. And I've done it. I worked with the World Bank, and I know it. China can get it done in 3 years, started and finished in 3 years, which is the political cycle for these people who have nominal democracies in Africa. Nominal, yeah. So I feel that it's mainly an economic construct, but that there is a political dimension, but not in the way people think. I don't think there's a calculated plan. It was dressed up as a vanity thing for Xi Jinping, as a political construct. Going out, so it became, Belt and Road, but it's everywhere. It's just China's selling its goods and services and cornering resources, but it's mainly an economic thing. But it is a very troublesome thing. But I think China's got to a breakthrough moment, which was in Uganda, where they were going to do a railway, and they saw that the bill for the railway would be more than the GDP, one year's GDP. So they said, we're not going to finance it. Finally, because I know China Development Bank very well, including their China Africa Development Fund, which finances these things. And they were telling me 10 years ago, we're really worried about our Africa investments, because they knew they were going to get burnt. So they didn't provide the money to Uganda, and the Turkish company is now going to do the railway. So I think there's a lot. There is some debt diplomacy, but I don't think it's a conscious way of enslaving those countries. Quite honestly,
I just want to ask Sarah if you'd like to, and then we'll come to you in a second. And particularly Sarah, the question from Simon about population.
Yeah, I think it has a gender dimension to it, and I also think it ties a little bit with the lying flat movement that the younger generation is experiencing now. So if you could speak on that.
Well,
can people hear the answer or not?
Oh yeah, so I thought the shrinking population also has a gender dimension to it, right? Because it has a lot to do with the fact that Chinese women, the educated, right, the ones who are participating in the economic force, they don't want to basically have babies, right, have kids. But that also ties in with the current lying flat movement among the younger generations of the Chinese youth. So I thought that was something that would be really interesting for you to speak about.
Good.
Yeah, the noise about China reaching the point where population is going to decline was a bit overdone. It's been happening for a long time. Everybody's been predicting this. And it's happening everywhere. It's happening in Japan, it's happening in Britain, America, the aging population. And there are consultants running around doing whole businesses on how to, to deal with an aging workforce in terms of preserving skills which are going to die off. It's interesting. So it's not unique to China, but I think it is highly significant, and I think it's a product of a botched one-child policy. When I was first there, it was two are okay, three are too many, and one is just perfect. Well, but that was under Mao. But it went down to one, and basically as you're right, young women, professionals, really don't necessarily want to have children, and they're willing to, they want careers, but there is a serious turn off on having children.
Well, thanks. I'd like to bring Owen in a second, but also answer the third question
on factionalism.
Yeah.
Could I just make my point very, very quickly?
Yes,
because
sure.
I was just going to venture to disagree, Paul, if that's okay.
No,
and it was really about the question about, I think some of these big loans in Malaysia, for example, have led, there's been a reaction against them.
And in Sri Lanka.
And Sure. Because of a sort of feeling that it's kind of debt bondage. So I just...
No, I totally agree that there are lots of instances like that. All I'm saying is that China's waking up that it's not good policy. And so I totally acknowledge it. Okay. I've seen examples of it.
Okay. Cool, and then the other one is the development of other factions opposing Xi.
Yeah. It's very hard to, put it this way. Xi has done a very good job of killing off, anybody who is a possible opponent using his anti-corruption campaign. The old story is that to get whacked in China, you have to be A, corrupt, and B, out of touch with the party's view. So a lot of them have been, the factions have been driven out. But I would say I don't think you can underestimate the importance of the third term of Xi Jinping. I think that for a long time, the two-term idea was working quite well. And if you were a 50-year-old up-and-coming party member and you thought you had a path to the Politburo, what would you think if your path was blocked by this guy who's going to be in his 80s and whatever, and he refuses to give up power? And he also had cronies around him. I think that is a destabilizing political factor and will lead to factionalism. And China's always had it's because it's highly secretive. In a way, the Communist Party, in some ways, the Communist Party is like a mafia party, but in other ways, it's like a party of different wings. Like the revolutionary party, the PRI in Mexico. There was a left wing and a right wing, which then eventually became separate parties. So I think that within the Chinese Communist Party, there are always different views about how to do things. And whether that crystallizes is another question into real opposition. But I think he's created a lot of problems for himself, because if anything goes wrong, and I thought COVID might have been a moment, I don't think it was a moment. If anything goes seriously wrong in the next 10 years in international relations or the domestic economy, he will be the fall guy straight away. And that will mean there'll be people out ready to knife him. And the Jiang family, Jiang Zemin family, they've all been taken out of good jobs. They've been all anybody with Jiang in their in their name, Jiang, the Jiang Zemin family. They've had a terrible time because that's what happened under Xi Jinping. So anyway.
Paul, thank you. We're getting close to ending, so I can take two more questions. The lady with the green jacket, and there's a lady right at the back. Yeah.
You can nail me later.
You can ask questions, of course, with a glass of wine in your hand outside afterwards, so just bear that in mind. Your name and the question, please.
Barbara Robertson, Diamond HR. I lived in Hong Kong for several years, a long time ago. Taiwan.
Yeah.
Given what's happened to Russia and its supposed easy invasion of Ukraine, and the West reaction to that in support of Ukraine, do you think it gives China pause about invading Taiwan?
Thank you. And the lady at the back, who had her hand up?
Of course, they're saying Xi's going to visit Putin in a few months.
I know. Yeah, you will.
Alison Stewart, and I'm just a member
Could-
of the public.
Could you talk a little bit louder, Alison?
Sorry, name's Alison Stewart, and I'm just an interested member of the public. I wondered if there was anything you could say about China's attitude towards climate change.
Yeah, a great question.
Thank you. Okay.
Wow.
So those are the last two.
Okay.
Another question's going to be outside. Yep.
Yeah. Would Ukraine give China pause? Well, China's goal with Taiwan, I think, is to keep the status quo as it is and not do anything rash in the near future. The two economies are very intertwined. I would stress that anything to do with Taiwan is not going to be dependent on economic arguments, but it's all about politics. China will kill off Hong Kong. It will kill off Taiwan if the political situation goes wrong, and they're prepared to do that. That's the way, the DNA of the party. So it is a very risky situation, but I think China is very happy to see the status quo, which is as it is today, which is relatively peaceful. But the trouble is, China is making noises saying it prefers the KMT, the Kuomintang, to the DPP, for instance, which is the party in power. And by doing that, it drives people in DPP towards a more independence posture. And at the same time, certain forces in America would like to up the ante, and Pelosi, now the new speaker, will go to Taiwan, and in doing that, they give succor to
Pelosi's successor, you mean?
Yeah. Will give succor to the independence movement, which isn't very big, by the way. And if there were an independence movement of any sort, China might believe they should do more. At the moment, I think China's reacting to American pressure, would like to see it calm down. So I don't think. The other thing is, I'm going to say very publicly here, I don't sense, as I've got two passports, so I'm American too. I don't think the American public is really lined up for a war to defend Taiwan. They might do a Ukraine thing, a proxy, a remote war. So I'm not against giving Taiwan weapons, because I think Taiwan has earned the respect of the world as a wonderfully democratic part of China. Yeah? It proves that China can run itself democratically. So, although it's a little easier in a smaller, part. So,
and climate change? Do you want to?
Climate change, yeah. I think China should get a lot of credit for what it's done in climate change. It still is ramping up its coal-fired power stations, but it's now 40% of the energy, 35% of the energy production is renewables, which is extraordinary what they've done, quite astounding. Plus the technology to do it. They have produced the best wind turbines.
Miles ahead,
and then another 10% is nuclear, which they're doing. So they are actually on course to peak, in like 2030, and then 2050 to be, neutral, which some people say is too slow because they are still building up their coal-fired, and it's hard if you're still a relatively developing country, So China's doing a good job. The other thing that I've been listening to and hearing about in the last, year or two is that China's done a really great job of actually enforcing its laws on environmental protection. China, very early on, brought in lots of laws, like all our laws, but the problem was the environmental protection at the local level was controlled by local forces and vested interests who wanted to continue doing the pollution. So the central government even had to have a separate central government agency down at the local level to supervise the local level of environment, to try and stop them doing the wrong things. What is happening is that they're increasing the fines, they're centralizing the control, and actually the very good side. For years I've been on the board, of China Dialogue, which is an environmental website which deals with environmental stuff. And I think if you read their stuff, you will see that China is doing a good job, but And they stopped selling coal power stations to the world, which is good too. So it's not a perfect picture, but I think they have done extraordinarily well. And it's not, and again, it's not because they're saints. The party is the Communist Party is a bunch of Methodists or friends. It's because the population was screaming. That we have to get clean air for our new middle class. We're leaving to come to Edinburgh if we can't get clean air. That's what they're saying. So this was life or death for the party. Again, it's all about what serves party rule. And not just because it's a nice thing to do. So it was driven by necessity, and I think they've done a fabulous job.
Paul, thank you. And on that note, as we close, I'd like to thank you all for your questions. And I know that there will be more that you can pose outside, but I just wanted to note one thing, that the very closing pages of this book, and if you haven't got it, you can get it afterwards, and you can get it signed, to say that what Paul writes is the following. He says, "My feelings over China are pulled in many directions. I have a deep admiration for China's remarkable and unanticipated achievements over the last 4 decades. Having myself made a small contribution in China's development, I not only feel some pride at what has been achieved, but also sadness at aspects of the China that is emerging from this long transition." And I'm minded of that well-known saying in Asia, "You have the watches, but we have the time," which is always worth remembering. So thank you again to the university. Thank you, Aidan, to the business school. Thank you all for coming and letting us get going again with our first actual physical meeting post-pandemic. And thank you to Sarah and to Owen for being on the panel. Thank you all very much.